Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Fantom, what some of our indicators are making of its price action, and some things we should be considering as we think about where Fantom might be going in a more long-term perspective. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So I wanted to start our conversation today with the upside-downside potential indicator for Fantom. If you're not familiar, this is our risk model here at the channel. Higher values closer to 5 are high risk, lower values closer to down to -5 are low risk. And this is the price history of Fantom over time. And you see that the UDPI has done a good job of identifying these high risk points where downside has followed soon after, as well as these low risk points that often precede moves to the upside. This is the long-term version of the model that cares about moves that play out over months to years, so more macro in its focus. And what you'll notice, what might stand out, is that we've gone back down into the deeper green zone like we've seen in some of these local bottoms in the past. And we can see this a bit more closely if I just show the raw output of the UDPI, the white line here, the UDPI level on the y-axis, and then I have here in the yellow the price action of Fantom over time, so we can see how these two things are relating. And so what you can see is that, the UDPI for Fantom, the long-term UDPI, is shot up to over 4 for both of kind of the all-time main peaks. So both the main peak coming up here in the big run-up, at least the initial run-up in 2021. And then we also saw that at around the top back over here coming out of the summer. But now we've fallen off quite a bit as Fantom has corrected to the downside quite a bit. We're actually re-entering a zone that's only been seen once before for Fantom on the long-term UDPI, dipping down below -4. This is only the second time in history that's happened, with the first time being the March 2020 crash. Now, what that's saying, what the model is basically saying there, is that in its estimation, there's quite a bit more upside potential for Fantom that's realistic than downside potential. Now, does this mean that this has to be the bottom and that price can't continue down from here? No, not at all. Certainly, there is more downside that is plausible. And the other thing that's important to note here is that, Fantom has never really experienced a full-on macro bear market. You could argue that this was a very bearish phase here. But again, the broader crypto market was beginning to move out of its bear market at this point. It was already moving into a bullish phase. So I would argue that the market conditions were quite different here relative to how they are over here. And of course, the UDPI learns from the price history of the asset that it's looking at. So it's a machine learning based model. It trains itself on the data that it is able to look at. And so, it's never seen Fantom in a full-on bear market. So that is one thing just to keep in mind. So even though we are re-entering this deep value zone potentially for Fantom, this is a different market condition, and the UDPI has never seen what Fantom is capable of doing in this type of environment, because it's kind of never existed in this type of environment before. So you have to just keep that in mind when you're interpreting UDPI data. But if we are near the bottom in the broader crypto space, and if things are, sooner rather than later going to flip a little bit more bullish potentially, then this would be a very plausible place for a bottom to maybe start forming. And it's certainly possible that, we're going to look back in a couple of years and see this as a very much a deep value zone for Fantom. But again, Fantom has never seen market conditions like this. So we can't be, there's nothing's guaranteed. And for sure, we should not just be assuming that more downside can't happen from here just because the UDPI is down below -4. Certainly more downside could happen. But if we are able to avoid kind of another big capitulation in the crypto space, if Bitcoin is able to kind of hold its own and not dump more, and if the broader macro conditions are able to kind of stop where they are, or at least not go into a full-on stock market meltdown, something like 2008, then certainly it's very possible that this will play out similar to the way that it played out back here, marking a pretty major bottoming point for Fantom, or maybe some moves back to the upside. Nothing's guaranteed. Obviously not financial advice. Should make your own decisions here. And again, all of this, in my opinion, is very much conditional on what happens with the broader crypto market, and then, of course, also what happens in the broader macro environment. So let's look at some other indicators here. So another indicator I want to talk about is the momentum bias indicator for Fantom. So if you're not familiar with this indicator, it's another machine learning based model we have here on the channel that quantifies momentum, and specifically momentum bias, this idea of momentum being biased to the upside and kind of pulling price up, or momentum being biased to the downside, where any moves back to the upside are quickly rejected back to the downside. And so the way you read this is that 0 is the average amount of momentum that Fantom has experienced, and of course that's positive because Fantom has very much trended up with time. And then the values here are denoted in standard deviations. So -1 is one standard deviation below the mean, +1 is one standard deviation above the mean. And so what you can see is that the momentum bias indicator tends to hang out a lot in the green in more bullish parts of Fantom's history, or the more bullish phases of the market, and hang out a lot in the red in more bearish times in the market. So you can see, bearish throughout here, flipping bullish through here, bearish through here, bullish through here, etc. And really what that's saying is that, in this point in Fantom's history, there was very much a positive momentum bias, that these corrections to the downside were just quickly reversed back up. The positive momentum kept pulling price upwards. Whereas in these more negative times, moves to the upside quickly get rejected. The negative momentum is pulling price action down with it. And that's very much the regime that we're in right now. We're very much in a negative, momentum bias regime right now. And in fact, we actually printed our lowest momentum bias value ever for Fantom in this big capitulation down here along, around the time of the UST Luna collapse. Now we are starting to chart a course back up, but really until we can start closing green, I'm not going to get too excited, essentially. And one of the things that we can look for with Fantom is, can we at least start to spend a decent amount of time in the green, or at least start oscillating around 0? Because in a lot of assets, when you start to show this kind of oscillation around 0, that can be the lead up into kind of a more bullish phase. Now, Fantom hasn't really shown that behavior specifically too much on its MBI, but other assets, when you look at the MBI, a hallmark of a gearing up to a more bullish phase is often kind of an equal oscillation around 0. And then especially when you get to these points where you're spending a lot more time in the green, or just exclusively spending time in the green and not really in the red, that is very much a bullish signature. That means that the asset is very much in a bull market. And then flipping down into the red is again where you might start to get a little bit more concerned. And then finally, also what's useful about the MBI is it can also identify these topping out points where the positive momentum got so kind of overextended that it oftentimes will be the case that you're near the top, if not at the top. But we're of course nowhere near there. So what I'm looking for in the MBI is for us to start at least getting back and spending some time up in the green, even if it's not a ton of time, even if we have to go back down, at the very least start spending more time up, start at least oscillating around 0 before getting too confident. Right now, with so much negative momentum bias, Fantom's got its work cut out for it to really start reestablishing a bullish footing, at least from this model's perspective. Now, obviously, that's not a super positive outlook, right? That's suggesting that Fantom, at the very least, is probably going to have to spend some time consolidating where it is. And, if the negative momentum is still strong enough, maybe that means more downside is going to happen. But what does this mean in a more long-term perspective? Because I think for a lot of people, longer-term investors, the short-term price action is kind of noise, right? For the people who are in an asset for a long time, they want to know more, is the asset on track relative to what we might hope it to be? Or are there concerning signs that are showing up? Now, there are different ways of looking at this. One of the ways that we've looked at this on the channel that I actually think is personally think it's a quite interesting way of evaluating this type of question about whether or not an asset is on track. Is it's performing as well as we might expect from a longer term perspective. What I like to look at is the average trajectory of a crypto asset from its inception, so the day it was created, or at the very least the day that we have price data on it, and then how is it growing over time? And so what I'm showing you here, this white line, is the average crypto trajectory of successful crypto assets. And the way I'm defining that is basically all the different assets that we monitor for our risk models here, which are all kind of by definition more successful assets, which is why we care about them. We don't really care so much about assets that have just gone to 0. Why would we bother modeling those? We care more just about what is the trajectory of the average successful crypto asset. And so that's what this white line is here. And the the y-axis is basically denoted in logarithmic price, and is adjusted because I basically set the price of all the assets to start at 0, and that's how you can create this average line. So the way that you interpret these values here is that 0 to 1 would be a 10x from the starting point, a 0 to 2 would be a 100x, if we got up to 3, that would be 1000x, etc. It's basically multiples of 10. So 0 to 10 would be 10x, 0 to 1 would be 10x, 1 to 2 would be 100x, etc. And so the way that we can kind of look at this then is I've also added this yellow line here, which is the best fit regression line, basically linear regression line. And the reason I'm using a linear fit here is that actually fits this data the best. The R squared, if you're familiar with that metric, is higher than if I use something like a logarithmic fit. So that's why I've used this. Now, the reason this is useful, and the reason that this can tell us something about whether or not an asset like Fantom is on track of what we might expect from a successful crypto asset, is we can really just compare it, right? We can just put on the price action, the adjusted price action of Fantom. So again, starting at 0 here, and then just look at how it's performed over its life. And we can see is that even though Fantom was kind of underperforming the average crypto asset, for a while, the average asset by the time it's 100 or 500 days old is generally speaking gone up and had positive returns, whereas Fantom had negative. But you see that by the time we got to 1,000 days of the network, or at least 1,000 days of price data being available, Fantom was exactly on track. It's right on this best fit regression line, and basically where the average trend line is. And then we can see that more or less it's still on track, right? We had these couple big bubbles here, back in the spring of 21, and then especially coming out of the summer of 21. And it seems like Fantom is kind of finding support, or at least kind of chopping along the exact kind of best fit regression line for the average successful crypto asset. And so what that means from my interpretation is that for now, at least, Fantom is just on track of where the kind of average successful crypto asset would be expected to be at this age, basically this number of days old. Now, obviously, Fantom was born in a time that wasn't especially bullish, but there are other things in this average, that also were born in a similar time. And so that's why this is just saying kind of agnostic to market conditions, where would you expect a given crypto asset to be at X number of days? Fantom is literally on track. It's literally exactly where we'd expect it to be based on the average trajectory of the average successful crypto asset. So I think that's a useful perspective, right? Because I think when a lot of people look at different assets, it's a little bit hard to know where it stands relative to what might be expected if it were to be following the path of other successful assets. This suggests that Fantom is on course. Now, this doesn't mean that Fantom has to stay on course, right? Certainly it's possible that it could just break down and just kind of go down to the doldrums forever. There's no guarantee this would have to keep up. But what it is saying is that for now, at the very least, it's exactly where we'd expect it to be, which is, I think, probably more of a good sign than a bad sign, right? We'd rather it be here than all the way down here already, certainly. So just a useful data point that I like to look at. And certainly if we see Fantom continue to kind of track this trajectory, this trend line over time, that would be a hopeful sign. And, we might have to wait a while if it would just merely be tracking this for it to get back up to its all-time high. But the idea would be that it would get there eventually. And who knows, you'd probably get bubbles that would form around it that could get us back there quicker should that happen. So this is one data point that I think says that Fantom is on track in a more long-term perspective right now. Now, another piece of data that I think is useful is to look at just DeFi adoption in Fantom. Because really with an asset like Fantom, DeFi is one of the reasons I would argue why it became such a big deal. And so I'm on DeFi Llama right now, and we're just looking at the different chains and the total value that they have locked on them, as well as the number of protocols, etc. And you see is that Fantom is currently coming in at number 7 for total value locked in DeFi on its chain. It has a ton of different protocols on its network, 240, just about under 240. And it has a decent amount of total value locked, right? 1.54 billion. And in fact, if we look at the ratio between its market cap and total value locked, it's the lowest of any of these assets that are in kind of the top 10 or even below. And the reason why some people look at this as being important is that, it's one way of potentially gauging, valuation of a network. Is it over or undervalued relative to some other chains? The idea being that the lower this value, the lower its market cap is relative to the total value locked on it, maybe the more undervalued it might be from the perspective of its usage in DeFi. Now, that doesn't guarantee that Fantom's going to just shoot off to the upside. In fact, Fantom has been sitting pretty low on this ratio for quite a while. That hasn't stopped its price from moving to the downside. But if we're just thinking about this kind of from a more long-term perspective, if Fantom's one of its main selling points, at least right now, but probably into the future, is its usefulness for DeFi or the amount of DeFi that's on it, then it's certainly sitting in a good spot with the value locked right now. It's got a bunch of protocols on it, and it seems to maybe even be relatively undervalued from that perspective relative to some of its competitors. And so should it be able to maintain this footing, stay a relevant player in the DeFi space, and weather out the bear market, it could be situated really well for when that next bullish impulse comes in, where more interest re-enters the DeFi space and more demand just naturally forms for Fantom as more people want to use the network. Because one of the things I think is useful to kind of note here is if we just look at the total value locked in DeFi right now in the crypto space, it's fallen off a cliff. It used to be up over, at around 250 billion. Now it's down to just 100 billion. There's been a huge exodus of DeFi. But should we get another big bullish phase that might bring a lot more money back into DeFi, that's the way it's generally gone, that in bullish phases, at least so far, that's when you see the big flows into DeFi. That could really advantage a chain like Fantom if it's able to maintain this position of being well suited or well poised in the DeFi space. So just something that I'm paying attention to. Now again, when this would play out, if and when this would play out is obviously an open question. We don't really know. But I do believe that if Fantom's able to survive the bear market and maintain usage and a lot of adoption in the DeFi space, it can be set up quite well after that. But again, there's certainly no guarantee, and that doesn't mean that more pain can't follow from here. I'm just flipping over here to the Fantom price chart, and Fantom has been a remarkably impressive asset, frankly, relative to even just some other successful assets in the crypto space. You see it being up, well over 200,000% from its absolute bottom back in the March 2020 crash. And Fantom tends to be a relatively volatile asset, even though it hasn't experienced, a full-on bear market per se. The biggest drawdown that it's seen in its life has been 96%, and we're actually, dabbling with that now with a maximum drawdown here of 93%, currently sitting down around 90%. So that doesn't preclude more pain from following, but it is just one thing with an asset like Fantom is that certain assets just seem like they're more volatile in percentage terms than others. Fantom seems to be a relatively volatile asset, and so in some ways it collapsing 90% isn't totally unexpected given what we've seen it do in prior bearish periods. But one thing that is notable in its recent price action is that it's actually been able to maintain a higher price level so far than its bottom in the summer, which is better than some other assets in the space. Even some L1s in the space have been able to maintain. So another thing to keep an eye on if it's able to maintain that kind of bullish structure. So what are my thoughts of Fantom overall? Well, I think if we think back on our different models we have here on the channel, it's sitting at what, the UDPI sees it as being in a value zone. It sees quite a bit more upside potential than downside potential that's realistic in kind of a more longer term perspective. But again, that doesn't preclude any more moves to the downside. Also, the MBI is not especially bullish on it yet, and so we'd like to see that kind of reverse. But when we kind of look at these more long-term fundamental perspectives, it is on track trajectory-wise with the average successful asset, and it still is maintaining a good spot in the DeFi rankings. And if those things can continue, I think Fantom could have a bright future ahead. But really what we're going to need to watch for going forward is just how bad does this bear market get? How bad does Fantom get hit? Because certainly if that thesis changes, there's a mass exit from the DeFi space. If it falls way off the trajectory we'd like to see it be on, then that might change the outlook to some degree. But, I think that if the broader market is going to find its bottom soon and start moving back to the upside, I think Fantom could be very well situated to do quite well in a bullish environment should that come back. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. Put a lot of updates about our indicators and more over there.